So today's video is going to be pretty simple. As you guys know, Kazuha is rerunning in the second half of next patch, so a little over 20-ish days from now, I guess. And I'm sure many people are wondering if he's worth getting for your account. As you guys know, I always recommend pulling for who you like, but that's mainly when it comes to picking a main DPS or damage dealers. But I also do recommend building around the DPSs you like, which can include pulling for supports to enhance them. So if you're an Ayaka main, it's always a good idea to look into pulling a grouper and some free supports for her. So characters and maybe even a weapon, these things can let you experience that character's full power, but at the end of the day it's your choice. So in this video I thought it would be a fun exercise just to go through a bunch of different DPSs and see if you main this character and you don't have Kazuha, is he in your character's best teams? Should you consider saving up for him? There's also debatable where, like, even if Kazuha might be in their best teams, there's a lot of other considerations, like maybe you might prefer a shielder or someone instead. There's also a section, I think I'll put a bunch of characters who have just too many teams that you don't need to worry about getting Kazuha. And then obviously there's a no section where there's no real link between playing that character and wanting to get Kazuha for their teams. Oh yeah, so before I get started on the actual character synergies, I think it's safe to say Kazuha is absolutely goated for overworld exploration, as well as a lot of different combat events. So if you're more of a casual player who doesn't care about the Abyss, then even just for exploration, I would definitely consider picking him up. He can jump, and unlike other characters, he can actually jump again when he's still in the air. This is pretty nice for movement in the overworld. Kazuha is also Animo, so he's one half of Animo Resonance. If you aren't already playing double Animo teams in the overworld, then you're missing out on this. Increased movement speed, stamina reduction, which is very nice in the overworld. Then he obviously also has great grouping and damage. If there's some sort of element nearby, like some pyro here, Kazuha can often just one-shot weaker enemies, which is very nice for farming different materials you might need. And lastly, he also has this talent here, further decreasing your party's sprinting stamina consumption, which is again very nice. Okay, so starting off with Raiden, if you were to ask me a few patches ago, I think I would have rated Kazuha very highly due to hypercarry teams like this. But now that Chevreuse has released, she came out in Raiden's last rerun, their synergy is so amazing. And the craziest thing is that Raiden's best general teams now have 3 4-stars. You could argue even these specific 4-stars. So if anyone went all in on this banner, you can basically get a complete Raiden team just from this one banner. So I'm sure many of you guys have seen calculations going around that Chevreuse teams are upgrades in DPS, and they're also really good in single target bossing. But I think what is less known is actually they are an upgrade in most AoE content too. So how can Chevreuse overload teams be better than Kazuha's grouping in AoE, you might ask? Well, let me explain. So Kazuha's grouping at the start of Raiden's setups is nice for sure, but after you use Raiden's burst, you can't switch out of her or her burst mode ends. That means that Kazuha's grouping is only helpful at the start of your setups, and everything after that, it just gets worse because Kazuha's VV debuffs need him to be on field triggering this. So when you're in AoE fights and new enemies are spawning and you're on field with Raiden, your damage just goes down without this. But here's the key thing, Raiden's burst slash and her charge attacks have very huge AoE. She doesn't actually need that much grouping, but I think what she does need is to not get punished by staying in on field with her. And that's what Chevreuse brings. Her buffs and debuffs will do their thing regardless of whether she's on field or not to mention how fast her animations are and the energy she generates for her team. So as you can see, even if you don't have her C6, she's still a great teammate for Raiden. And these new teams, like either this team or replacing Bennett with Xiangling, kind of almost outclass all of Raiden's old teams. And then not to mention, Raiden has her Hyper Bloom team, she has Raiden National, Double Hydro, Quicken teams. She has too many playstyles that you shouldn't really have to worry about picking up Kazuha just for her. So diluc used to use Kazuha a lot, but these days, as you guys might know already, most players have moved over to plunge teams with xianyun. As always with diluc, I do recommend you guys check out Pullin's channel. This guy is basically a professional diluc main. Also, the really good thing or bad thing is that basically diluc's constellations are useless now in plunge teams. You've got like 15% more damage here. You've got a bit of attack here, but this attack speed is useless. This is useless here. This is useless. This is useless. This is useless. So just getting C0 and a weapon for him, he's basically done. You don't even need to worry too much about his skill and burst talents anymore, although his skill is nice for energy, and his burst will be needed for the pyro infusion if you have to leave Bennett circle or you just aren't playing him with Bennett at all. Now if you're a keqing main, I've covered keqing teams many times on my channel before, but honestly Kazuha is just so good for this team. Not only are his buffs good, but he also does a lot of damage himself. In quicken teams, his short cooldowns on his skill and burst are also very nice because keqing teams have a lot of quick swap potential. So you are able to swap into Kazuha frequently just to reapply grouping and get some extra damage. And reducing your stamina consumption is also very nice because keqing does a lot of charge attacks. And yeah, overall, I know like someone like Sucrose is playable here, but it definitely does feel a lot worse. Sucrose's cooldowns on her grouping, like 15 seconds, 20 seconds, is just way too high for a keqing team. And whilst her EM buffs and something like her C6 buffs here are very nice, and you can potentially get even slightly higher max hits with the Sucrose in your team, Sucrose herself won't really be doing anywhere near as much damage as Kazuha does either. So honestly, I think most keqing players would agree that Kazuha is just very important for her, and not only just damage wise, he just feels very nice to play. And if you are a keqing player, I definitely would recommend considering putting Kazuha for her. Next DPS, Klee. Now Klee is very interesting. So I made a video on this before, but with Farina's release, Klee's new general best teams are something like this, where you use the team's pyro application to forward vape Farina's skill hits. And Farina is also a very good buff herself for Klee, but the thing is you can also play a triple pyro team like this, and it works very nice. Even though without Kazuha's grouping you have less control over Klee's mines. Obviously with Kazuha you can also play mono pyro teams like this, and there are also new plunge melt teams with Klee that are very interesting as long as you don't run into energy problems. So whilst you could definitely still argue that Kazuha is in Klee's strongest teams, Klee is actually getting quite a few teams now, and honestly I don't think I would consider Kazuha super essential for her teams anymore. Obviously I would still definitely recommend him if you have the primos available, just so you have that flexibility to play Klee's strongest team for any given situation. But if you're a Klee main, I think it's your decision if you want to get Kazuha or not. Have a think about the different teams and which ones you want to play. Child mains, honestly, I think it's a no-brainer. International 3 years later, it's still his premier team, and I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. Similar to keqing, even if you can get like higher max hits with Sucrose, and she is definitely still very playable versus bosses. Kazuha's flexibility on his setups, Kazuha's better grouping. Also, Child is another character where you spam a lot of charge attacks and you do a lot of dash cancels, so I definitely also notice this a lot. I notice when I play Sucrose, I'm often out of stamina on Child and just have to spam normal attacks, which is definitely very suboptimal. So yeah, Child mains, definitely consider going for Kazuha. So for Ganyu mains, you're probably using melt teams, but her melt teams are actually very flexible. Now you can argue teams with Kazuha like with this, or with Shenhe, or with Nahida. You could argue that Kazuha has the best ceiling, and whilst I would agree for sure, the thing is Ganyu is a charge attack bow character, and most people can't really play Ganyu without a shield. Most people would find a team like this too difficult to play, and they find a team like this much more smoother. And playing Zhongli here isn't even a big of a damage loss, honestly. There are still many people speed running with a team like this. So yeah, I think Ganyu goes into debatable. You can have a think about it. If you want to utilize Ganyu's higher ceiling teams, then you might want to look into getting Kazuha. But for most people, you're perfectly fine using Zhongli, and I don't think you need to worry too much about getting Kazuha for her. Next DPS, Shao. I think it's pretty obvious he'll go in no. But Farazan is an animo buffer, so you technically could play like Kazuha in a team like this. I think it's safe to say that's just a very niche situation, and if you're a Shao main, you just don't need to worry about Kazuha. Then there's Hu Tao. I think this is a very hot topic. but it might be similar to the Ganyu situation. Hu Tao's most popular team is basically still this. I think that's because Zhongli's shield is just too nice for Hu Tao teams, and the problem is, while some people do play a team like this with Farina, without much healing in your team, you don't get to utilize Farina as much as possible, so you have to replace Zhongli with a healer, maybe something like this, but most people don't want to replace Zhongli, so they just stick with the old teams. Now for Hu Tao and Kazuha synergy, if you're into speed running, then you'll know that technically this team is still like her highest potential teams. You got Yelan buffing Hu Tao's damage, Kazuha swirling pyro. This gives the highest hits for Hu Tao, and a team like this is still Hu Tao's most popular speed running team, but VV vape teams are still not that popular with the wider player base. And yeah, replacing Zhongli in a Hu Tao team for most players is a no-go. And yeah, even with Farina's release, even with xianyun's release, most players are still going to be playing a team like this, even though you can use Kazuha here as well. But I think it's safe to say at best you'd put her here just because there's so much variety. The average player wants to play Zhongli. Maybe some players feel like Farina is in Hu Tao's best teams, and maybe some speedrunners feel like VV Vape is in Hu Tao's best teams. She just has so many teams that you just don't need to worry too much about Kazuha for Hu Tao unless you're wanting to speedrun. Eula, I think it's quite obvious. Physical DPS, she would just be no. There's no real correlation with being a Eula main and needing to consider getting Kazuha. Although I do wish we got a physical grouper, hopefully sometime soon. Ayaka, honestly, she kind of goes here. This team here, I think even after Farina's release, is just Ayaka's most popular team. For casual play and speedrunning, it's just so smooth. And the issue is with Farina, you have to do someone like Charlotte, unless your Farina is C6. But playing a team like this, whilst it's still nice and I don't mind it, still one of Ayaka's best teams overall. It's not her best team just because the setups in this team are just a bit too scuffed. As I covered in my review, even though Farina has really good synergy with Ayaka, there's so much potential here. It's just the team as a whole with the other two pieces, it just doesn't fit quite as well. Like I said, the setups, trying to double buff both Hydro and Cryo and using TTDS on Charlotte, it's just a bit too scuffed, especially compared to playing Shenhe and Kokomi. It's hard to compare a team that's a bit scuffed versus a team that is just so simple to play. But as you can see, regardless of the type of Ayaka team you play, Kazuha is just the ideal animo character for this slot. And even if you play like a mono cryo team like this versus bosses, Kazuha is still again essential for this team. His buffs are very useful, his grouping is very useful for Ayaka's burst, to optimize Ayaka's burst. I do think in the future it is possible to replace Kazuha. Just get someone with a bit of grouping and who doesn't need to do complicated double swell buffs. I think for now, definitely consider Kazuha, he's just too valuable for her. Yoimiya, honestly, it's a very similar situation to Ganyu and Hu Tao. Whilst I don't have Yoimiya on my own account, I have done a lot of viewer abysses now using Yoimiya. And the thing is, Kazuha is in Yoimiya's highest damage teams, but a lot of people can't play Yoimiya without a shield, which is a bit unfortunate because Kazuha usually competes in the same team slot as someone like Zhongli. But honestly, at least personally, I don't think Yoimiya is that hard to play without a shield. I think she's easier to play without a shield than Ganyu is, to be honest. It just takes a bit of practice, but I think I would still put Yoimiya here rather than with Hu Tao, just because whilst she does have a lot of different team variations like Hu Tao does, I think she can get more out of Kazuha than she can get with other teammates. If there's any Yoimiya mains in the comments, then feel free to comment if you agree or disagree. So yeah, I think it's debatable if you want to consider getting him or not. Now Kokomi, I think these days a lot of people either play her in nilou teams or they play her in some sort of mono hydro team or maybe taser team, something like this or that. But Kokomi is very versatile in her teams. I think getting Kazuha is very optional, honestly. In fact, you can even do quad hydro teams, something like this, and it's pretty similar to playing Kazuha, so he's not that big of a deal, honestly. If you want to be a Kazuha main, obviously get Kazuha. Funny enough, his punch teams are actually pretty strong in the Abyss now. Ito, no, I think it's quite obvious. Miko, now honestly, whilst Miko can be similar to keqing if you're playing her in her on-field quicken teams, they do benefit a ton from Kazuha, but Yoimiya is a lot more flexible. A lot of people like her dual DPS teams with Tighnari or with Alhaitham. So her cooking teams are just a lot more flexible, and there's plenty of options that Kazuha is very optional in them. Ayato, a lot of his most popular teams do use Kazuha, but he's just a very versatile character with too many teams at this point. None of them really stand out. Cyno, I don't actually really play too much Cyno at all, but I know if you're playing Cyno in an aggregate team, you might want to consider using Kazuha, but I think most people play him in Hyperbloom teams these days. So again, Kazuha is very optional for Cyno. Now Nilou is very interesting. So as I'm sure you know, I'm a huge fan of Nilou, particularly the bloom teams. I've done a ton of videos on these bloom teams before, but honestly from my experience there are a lot of Nilou mains who just want to play her in vaporized teams even if they don't have C6 or anything, and in vaporized teams Kazuha is very huge, so I wouldn't actually put her in no even at C0. If you do want to play vaporized teams then you can consider it, but Nilou quite clearly, so many teams, you don't need to worry about getting Kazuha unless you really want to play those teams. Wanderer, similar to Shao, no, but again, I do know some people do like playing Kazuha in these triple animo teams with Farazan, but that's quite clearly very optional and not their most popular teams. Although I will say Wanderer and Kazuha together are both very good exploration characters. So Dia, I'm actually just checking her usage rates at the moment just to see how much people are still playing Dia on field. And it seems like these days her off-field teams are way more popular than on-field teams, which is quite a shame, I guess. But if you do want to play Dia on field, then I do know Kazuha is very huge for her. Alhaitham, Denjo carry, no. Lyney, now Lyney's very interesting. I play a lot of Lyney these days, and whilst you could definitely still argue that Kazuha is in his strongest teams, like I would say this mono pyro team here is still generally Lyney's strongest team, most flexible, most versatile team, but he still has the same problem that Ganyu does, where most people just can't play Lyney without a shield, and usually that means removing Kazuha and adding in Zhongli or Dia. Although unlike Ganyu, you can play both of them together, but I think looking at this, you can tell most people just can't play him without a shield. I also do think vape teams with Farina can be decent in speed running, and it's similar to Klee, you either use Kazuha or you do like a triple pyro thing, but I do prefer his mono pyro teams with Kazuha overall. And I think if you're a Lyney main, it's debatable if you want to go for Kazuha. Can you play without a shield? What types of teams you want to play? You'll have to make that decision for yourself. Tighnari, I think it's safe to say no. Now, if you watched my recent video on neuvillette, I think it is safe to say that neuvillette is so strong that a lot of people can just play him in any team and get good results, but I do consider Kazuha his strongest teammate. That might be debatable. Some people consider Farina his best teammate, but Kazuha is a very good buffer for neuvillette. Although neuvillette doesn't need Kazuha's grouping as much as other characters, Kazuha's buffs, debuffs, his swirl giving a draconic stack is very nice. Honestly, if you're a neuvillette main, definitely consider getting Kazuha. The only issue is obviously they're both rerunning at the same time, so if you have to pull both of them from scratch, obviously if you're a neuvillette main, prioritize neuvillette, but also just try to get lucky. Maybe you can get one of them early. Wriothesley, honestly I don't play Wriothesley that much. Usually players have him with C6, and he's so strong at C6 that people just play him solo and just brute force all the content. But as you can see, the thing with Wriothesley is that he doesn't really have a standout team. Unfortunately, he didn't get a signature support, so people play him in a lot of different teams. There isn't really a standout, but Kazuha is still here if you're playing melt teams, freeze teams, mono cryo teams. I actually do see a lot of people liking this team here with Zhongli, Bennett, Xiangling. But yeah, I think Wriothesley has too many teams to worry too much about Kazuha, even though you could argue Kazuha is in a lot of Wriothesley's highest potential teams. And then Navia, obviously no, and that's basically it, at least for like 5-star DPSs. And I know I didn't cover every single character, like every single 4-star DPS. We've still got over 3 weeks for his rerun, so I might make some more videos about Kazuha. Do let me know if you want help for any specific teams, like for example rotations with specific Kazuha teams, or how to do different setups, and I can look into doing that. But yeah, if you are thinking about getting Kazuha, hopefully this video did help you in regards to considerations, and thanks for watching. Bye for now.